Welcome to the New Masculine podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. My next guest is a heavy hitter in the world of transformation for men and masculinities. Sean Harvey is an ordained minister and the Chief Compassion Officer and founder of Symphonia Institute, which is dedicated to developing the next generation of compassion-centered bridge builders, facilitators, leaders, and changemakers equipped to form authentic and purpose-driven communities, innovate collaboratively, redefine leadership models, reimagine systems and structures, and transform cultures. He personally identifies as a queer man, as a spiritual leader, as a masculinity guide, and a systems transformation expert. Sean and I find a deep kinship in the fact that we are both gay men who share a passion for working with men, regardless of their sexuality, and on creating new models of masculinity in the world. He is doing some big work to transform masculinity that is so ripe in our current U.S. cultural conversation. For example, as we record this conversation, he's about to launch Project Compassion, which seeks to bring compassionate masculinity to some of the most hyper-masculine spaces: police departments, federal law enforcement agencies, and military security forces. Whoa, I get chills thinking about the potential impact of this work. I'm lucky enough to call Sean a friend, and I'm thrilled he agreed to join us on the New Masculine. So let's get him into the conversation and find out more about him. Welcome, Sean.
Hey, Travis. Thanks for having me.
You are doing some big work, my friend, and I'm so excited that people get to know more about it through our conversation.
Yeah, some days I just sit here going, wow, what am I doing?
I know the feeling. I definitely know the feeling. Is there anything else about you that I didn't mention that you think people should know about you before we jump into this conversation?
I think how I came to this. Can I tell a little bit about my story?
Please do. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So I am the son of truckers. I was supposed to be a third generation long haul trucker. So my grandfather, my father, even my mother, they were all on the road. And I was an androgynous kid. So it wasn't that I was choosing to be my identity expression as gender fluid or non-binary. It's just that I looked and acted a certain way that a lot of people thought I was a girl. And so it was sort of like that was the interpretation, back in the 70s of being this more androgynous kid. So I think on some subconscious level was looking at masculinity, from a very young age. And then when I was an adult, this journey took me from working on Wall Street to then being a college professor to working in fashion and going to seminary and now working with cops. So, really kind of tapping into a lot of different worlds, to be able
what
to
a
get
journey.
to this place. Yeah, it's been a wild journey.
Yeah, that's quite a journey you've been on. It's a lot of different areas. And what people can't see, because we're on a podcast, is you don't look androgynous at this point. And so it's interesting to hear that you grew up as an androgynous child that people may have assumed or related to you as a girl. And yet currently you look very masculine with a beard and shaved head and What's that been like for you to sort of live in both worlds?
I think it's given me an ease to be able to, as I think about masculinity, as I worked in a company that was built entirely on feminine leadership and on the feminine, to feel an ease in both worlds, and to really understand that at our core, regardless of how we identify gender-wise, that we have these energies within us. And based on social conditioning, societal conditioning, familial conditioning, religious conditioning, media, peers, that for many of us, those messages have, really taken us to this place of we've elevated one energy and suppressed another.
Yeah.
And in that suppression of other, I think because, when I think about it, we're gendered before we're raced, before we're sexualized, before any of those things happen. We are gendered 9 months before we're born. The moment our parents know that they're pregnant, we're already being conditioned and put into either the male or female box. And from that place, a lot is packed into the shoulds. How should we be? How are we supposed to be? And so, when one of those energies is suppressed, that can often lead us into this place of having shame or fear around touching it. And as a New Yorker, that third rail of like, we're going to get electrocuted if we touch that place where the shame is. And so we don't touch it. We don't deal with it. We don't look at it. And often that's what inhibits us in our own connection to our humanness and to our humanity.
Oh, that's, already profound in the way that you're sharing, and is so aligned with my experience of the world. So thanks for already putting it in such clear terms. Mm-hmm. I'd love to start by talking to that androgynous kid and find out some of the stories that come to mind when you think about what you learned about being a boy in this world, being an androgynous boy, being an androgynous person in the world. What did you learn about what you were supposed to be in terms of being a man?
Well, and then you put that backdrop of being around from a family of truckers.
Yeah.
And both my grandfather served under General Patton in World War II, and my father was a Vietnam vet. So both hyper-masculine men, yet at the same time, deep wisdom and heart-centered men. But I always, I think I always just felt that I was different. I think I was confused a lot of times. Like I wasn't fitting into the mold. And so I didn't really know how I fit. And so I think for most of my life, I carried a less than mindset. I wasn't man enough. I wasn't showing up in the ways that other men did. So since I didn't fit the mold, I didn't feel like there's always that not being man enough. And having to, I think for me, where others might accept it and just like live in their truth, I think I hid for most of my life, and I hid behind where I was strong. I hid behind my intelligence. I hid behind my strengths. I hid behind, what I look like on paper from an intellectual perspective. And I went that route. And so ultimately, as an adult, I looked amazing on paper by most of our society standards. And at the same time, my life was always pretty anemic. And I wasn't putting the attention into my life because I don't think I valued myself in the way that I need to value myself, because I always thought that I was less than.
I get that.
So I made up for it in my credentials, in my education, in my career. And had a deep disconnect between who I was professionally and who I was personally.
I really get that. I think I spent a lot of time of my childhood masking what I felt as a personal failure through my perfectionism, being amazing at school, being great at music, being great at things that I could perform and could get external validation from, but feeling a deep flaw within myself internally. So I can really hear that and feel that. How did the men like your father or your grandfather interact with you based on you being not sort of fitting into that mold of masculinity?
I think my grandfather died when I was 5. And so I think I was more androgynous probably from like 7 or 8 on. But as a young child, I was still very boyish, and I was still, um, my voice hadn't cracked yet. And so, uh, my grandfather, I just remember my grandfather telling me these stories of Little Red Chief. You know, I'm part Cherokee, and he would tell me these stories every night before bed of, about this Cherokee Indian boy and the journeys he would go through, and the adventures he would be on. And my grandfather was always reiterating and reinforcing this idea of the compassionate heart, being a compassionate warrior, and, you know, having a moral compass, and, sort of, I guess in some ways, the initiation rites of this Cherokee boy. And he was like trying to instill these messages with me. With my father, I think, you know, we always have those moments that tell us that we're different. And I think for me, it was my father taking me out. My father was a truck driver, so I'd see him probably once a quarter. And he would take me out by the side of the house. And we had this big backyard, and he would try to throw clay catch with me. And I could never catch the ball. And I just remember seeing his look of disappointment. And I think it was just etched in my brain these few times that I see my father, and like when he tries to do something, with his boy, and I just couldn't do it. And so I think there was a lot of shame for me around that. And I don't think my dad and I don't think we ever had a close relationship. I think I had a much closer relationship with my grandfather. With my father, I don't think we really, he was proud of me, he loved me, but at the same time, we never had a close, we didn't have a close relationship until, probably the last 6 months before he died. But for most of my life, we did.
What were those last 6 months of his life like for you?
Well, you know, I came out to my mother when I was 15. As a gay man. I didn't really officially tell my father until I was 27. And when I told my father, and we didn't talk for 14 years. And so I talked to him. We reconnected when I found out from my stepsister that he was dying. And, so my ex of 7 years, and we were exes at that point, said, I'm coming with you. Like, I was with you for 7 years. I need to understand where all this comes from. I want to meet your father, and I want to be a support to you. So about a year out before he passed, we went out to Detroit, and it was a very awkward conversation. It was an awkward time. And, we were there for a weekend, and it was just disconnected. There was, yeah, it was a bad scene. And then the Thursday after that weekend, so 4 days later, he calls me up and, you know, asked me how long I was married to Matt. And I said, well, we were domestic partners. But then he said, you know, son, I'm not judging you, but I can't condone your life choice. And you're going to hell.
Ooh, heavy.
That was where we landed. And then my dad, because I'd opened the door, wanted to stay connected. And so, it was really rough. I mean, the first few times he called, I would either ignore his calls or just like put it off. And then I made a choice. I said, you know, I can either live in the resentment or I can live in the love. I'm going to choose unconditional love. And so I made that choice. And so I started taking his calls, and it was awkward at first. And we started to get to know each other a little more. Reconnect. And then there was one time when he was saying, he was talking politics, and, you know, we were different politically. And he would come up with all these statements, and then I would argue with facts, the statements. And at a certain point he was chuckling, and I was like, whoa, wait. No one ever calls you out on your bullshit, do they? And he said, no. And I said, you know I'm your son, right? I said, whatever you do, I'm going to do better because that's how this works in the father-son dynamic. So you throw it out there, I'm going to throw it back harder. And he laughed and we got it. And I think it was that moment that we realized we are legit father and son, stubborn as anything. And that shifted our relationship. And then we would talk and I really got the ways that he was suffering. I forgot. I really got the ways he was in pain based on his choices. And I really got to the place of forgiveness on so many levels. So it was the weekend before he died, and I went to see him, and I drove out by myself, and I drove from New York to Detroit because I wanted to get a feel for what it was like for this man who's been driving a truck for 43 years. So I drove, got to the hotel, I got to the hospital, and we spent like 12 hours together over 2 days. Later in the first day and the second day, I asked him, I said, what advice would you give your only son, your only child? And he said, son, don't let anybody get your powder wet. And I said, my powder? He's like, your gunpowder, son, your gunpowder. He said, don't let anybody extinguish your flame. I want you to be proud of who you are and what you are, and don't let anybody diminish who you are or what you are. And so in that moment, I got that we have a choice in life. We can either live in the resentment or we can live in the love. And by living in the love, that is what can create transformation. That is what can create the bridge and create healing. And so now, as I do work with cops, I remember being with my Vietnam vet, Republican, truck driving dad, and getting him to move from that place of dismissiveness and even hatred to that place of love. And what becomes possible when we bring that love and compassion into hypermasculine cultures and spaces like with cops and the military, where if we can see and honor their experience and their journey, as opposed to judging just what we see on the surface, and we can move from in these masculinity conversations from this idea of things being toxic, where we're implicit in toxic masculinity. This is language I never use. But when I hear it, what it suggests is that something's broken and needs to be fixed. And I think the alternative approach is we're all wounded by the construct of masculinity in some way or another because it constricts us into a way of being that has a should. And when we can see things from a place of wounding, then we have the opportunity to come in from a place of healing. And the fixing is a masculine approach and the healing is a feminine approach. And I think what more men need than anything is the access to the feminine for the healing they need to come into a place of true authenticity and connection with the world and themselves.
Yes. Period. Yes. Yeah. I totally agree. As your friend, it's really interesting to hear you sharing this because it's connecting some of the dots for me to understanding why you're leaning so heavily into the masculinity work you're doing in police reform and sort of these hyper-masculine cultures. Your life experience has been about transformation in pretty hyper-masculine spaces and moving from, as you were saying, that you sort of escorted your dad through from dismissiveness to love, and you were moving yourself from resentment to love. It's like you both were walking journeys, but that they were about meeting each other instead of walking away from each other. I'm really struck by, as you were talking about, the level of empathy that it required for you to be able to get there. Like you said that you drove to see him because you wanted to basically be in his shoes, to experience what it was to be that truck driver for that many years and to really lean into the experience of another, even though that other has been harmful to you or has said things that were painful or dismissive or disregarding your value as a person. I think it's super powerful. How were you able to, I think now I hear you talking about moving from resentment to love. What was that journey like? How did you move from that? Because it doesn't seem like it would be as easy as just, oh, I'll just choose love.
It all happened while I was Eileen Fisher. And
so the clothing brand, the feminine clothing brand.
The women's clothing line,
Yeah.
Yeah. So working at Eileen Fisher was a company that was built entirely on the feminine. And so when I found out about my father, my bosses were like, "You're going to go see your dad." I said, "No, I'm not." They're like, "No, you are." And so I was really in that, I'm not going to see this man. Like, forget him. And they're like, "You have to go see him." And my boss sat me down. She's like, "If you don't see him, you're going to regret this. This will be one of your life regrets for the rest of your life." So, but, I think it actually started this part of the journey to the masculinity work. I mean, well, it's been a lifelong journey. It started really when I left Wall Street and went to work for Eileen Fisher, because I had an 8-month interview process at EF. But and when I got the job, it was what happened on my first day that I think changed everything. And that's when my two bosses sat me down for lunch on my first day and said, "Sean, you have proven yourself in the interview process. Now we want you to stop proving yourself and learn how to be who you authentically are. When you came to us and you interviewed with us, you showed us your heart and you showed us your polish. We want to see more of your heart and less of your polish. We want to see you unedited and unfiltered, and we want to help you get there."
Whoa. I have never heard an employer say something like that.
Right. And then it was basically a 5-year journey at Eileen Fisher that was taking me into this work of the healing through the feminine. When I meet a lot of other men who've done men's work and are part of other types of men work experience or the more traditional men's work experience, they're often getting to masculinity, like the healthy masculine, but through a masculine approach, right? Or they're in that balance, but this is to come to the healthy masculine through an immersion in the feminine is very rare. And then when I meet men in men's work, we're still meeting at the same level. We're still meeting at a similar vibration and frequency and understanding. We've just gone about it in very different ways. When I think about the next frontier of men's work, I think that connection to the feminine and the inspiration of women in how do we do men's work, I think is important, because often I see that in men's work, we leave it at we're learning how to connect in healthy ways with other men, but there's not always a roadmap for how men who do men's work can then connect with women in healthy ways. Because there's still certain tensions that aren't addressed in a lot of men's work that create the opportunity for us to do true gender bridge building.
Yeah. So what do you see as the benefit of going through the pathway of immersion to the feminine to get to the healthy masculine? What are the benefits of that versus the benefits of going at it through the masculine?
I think it's a gentler approach. I think it takes any sort of how you should be, and allows you to come into a relationship with the what is, and encourages us to be more curious, and allows us to come in and experiment and explore and play in spaces and in ways that we normally wouldn't, that we wouldn't even know we have access to. And then what I found is, because I would talk to the men at Eileen Fisher and I would be like, "Hey, yo, I know I'm noticing I'm changing. You changing?" And they're like, "Yeah, I'm noticing I'm changing too." And I'm like, "How are you changing?" And they would say, and most of the time it would be prefaced with, "Well, my wife said, or my girlfriend said." but it was my wife said I'm more patient, or I listen differently. I'm more comfortable with nuance. Um, I stopped needing to be right all the time, and I started to be more curious. I started to be able to tap into my emotions differently, and I started to be more creative. My creative expression was evolving. And I started making space for others. I think that inclusion piece is implicit when it comes from the feminine because it wants all voices to be seen and heard.
I think that inclusion piece is inherent in the feminine and is such an important piece that I observe to be missing in many men's work communities that are out there. That queer men don't feel safe and welcome in them, that men of color don't feel safe and welcome in them. It's the challenge that I think it's not always necessarily from a bad intention or malintention that these spaces aren't inclusive, but the work isn't being done around inclusivity, or it's maybe just lip service to it, but no actual engagement with it. And I do think the feminine has that quality that creates that safe container, that creates that ability for people to be as is and to allow the curiosity to play out within men's work rather than the dictate what a man should be or sort of the fixing something that's broken, as you were saying that the masculine does. It actually allows the development process to play out a bit more.
I would add two other things to that as you're talking, which is it also gets us to look at the power dynamics that are at play in a different way and to understand the power dynamics are shifting as the voices of women continue to elevate and are in more spaces. And that then translates into how do we understand power dynamics around, gender, around race, around sexuality, around ability. Like we can just go on, but it's like we are in this place where power dynamics are shifting. I think the feminine allows us to have more flexibility and agility to be able to adapt, and have a different understanding and appreciation. So I think that's an important distinction as well.
And that flexibility is so important in our current world right now. Everything feels really brittle and in our world right now. It's so high stakes. It's so ready to fracture and break, and someone has to lose and someone has to win. And that flexibility feels, to me, like hearing you talk about it, I just sort of relax inside because that feels like the medicine. That feels like the healing that's needed right now, especially in our current cultural conversations.
As a minister, then I often think about this as there's the masculine, there's the healthy masculine, there's the healthy feminine. And there's also the journey that we go through as humans from the masculine into the feminine as men, which then takes us into the integration of the two, which then as we continue to take that further, really takes us into the sacred masculine and feminine, or the divine masculine and feminine, and takes us into a different place of spiritual well-being. And so another way I think about this, because the journey has led me to seminary, to become a minister, to be also, as much as I can go into these spaces with police, I can also do it in corporations, but there's also an underlying premise for me of the spiritual aspect of this journey. And really taking us into the essence of who we are called to be and contribute in the world that comes from this place of deep authenticity, soul-inspired compassion, where we are breaking open our hearts in a way that we can have a compassionate heart for others, where we are seeing, understanding, and responding to and preventing the suffering of others. And you can look at compassion from the place of the masculine or the feminine in terms of how we protect, how we heal, how we nurture, how we care for. There's masculine and feminine expressions of compassion. But we've also bastardized this idea of compassion so much that many of us only see it as being this expression of weakness. And, it's one of those places where I think when I talk about compassion and masculinity, which is how I define masculinity, that masculinity being a construct that influences so much. And if we inject compassion into it, what does it do? And it really is this way of creating this integration where we are more holistic, more whole, and are able to tap into our essence and our deeper humanity in a way that we can start to see others from this place of the deeper humanity in others. And then it takes a lot of the ways we perceive division, and it allows us to take our connections to a soul level, and we can start to connect in a very different way.
So this languaging that you're using around compassionate masculinity, do you have any clear ways that you define what that means, or ways that you, if you were telling, like, how would you identify that someone is leaning into compassionate masculinity?
I see it as a balance of head and heart. I see that as one way. I see it as really being more of moving from the intellectualized conversation of masculinity to an embodied way of being, where we are truly integrated. Because what I've found is so much more opens up for me when I am in my true essence, when I am able to be integrated in the masculine and feminine, when I'm able to be in the world from a compassionate heart, to be able to come from this place of curiosity and seeking to understand what's happening, as opposed to operating from this place of judgment and operating from this place that the world needs to look like this, as opposed to being curious about how the world actually exists, how people are, and giving a lot more permission to myself to be able to see things for who others are, as opposed to being disappointed in the world in ways others are not.
Yeah, it makes me laugh because I feel like one of my biggest learnings in life is all around the ways that I argue with reality, and that I feel safest when I can predict and create predictability and create habits and structures. And yet life keeps showing me that that's not how the world works. And that constant ability to tap into what is versus what I think it should be, or I have the reality that I've created in my mind, that I'm constantly trying to manipulate reality to fit that picture that's in my mind. And what happens when I let go of that struggle is constantly my life's work. I love being someone who loves to argue with reality at times.
Get that.
Yeah.
I get that for myself as well.
As you're talking about this balance piece, I always keep with me, and you're talking about spirituality and balance. I always keep with me while I'm doing recordings for this podcast. It's a Shiva lingam. It's a stone that's I believe it's rolled in a river in India, and they're oval in shape and they're smooth. But there's bands of darker reddish brown stone, and then there's lighter gray stone within it. And I got my first ever one that I ever got of these. I got during a massage, and the massage therapist, I was face down. The massage therapist put it in my hand, and I just rolled it through the whole session. But I didn't see it, didn't know it, and I just was just rolling it in my hand and enjoying it. And I asked at the end, I said, I just love that. And he was like, well, this is for you. And do you know what it signifies? And this is before I even committed to the work that I'm doing around masculinity. But he said it signifies the balance of the masculine and feminine. And so it was just like this meeting of the moment. And so I always keep one with me while we're having these conversations on the new masculine, because it's a stone, it's heavy, it anchors us into that balance of the masculine feminine, and it has sort of like a nature spiritual element to it that really guides the conversation, so that I don't have to hold it all, that it's anchored here within the space as well. So you have had an interesting journey. As you were saying, you used to be a consultant in Wall Street, masculine space, hyper masculine space in some ways. You transitioned into a leadership role at Eileen Fisher, a very feminine space, learning about feminine leadership, healing, watching your own sort of transformation. And now you're moving back into some pretty hyper-masculine spaces, as you've been sort of alluding to in your work with police. Share with me a little bit about the work that you're doing and where what this is, this work that you're doing with police.
So a group of us formed, actually after, I had lived in, Asheville, North Carolina for 9 months after 19 years in New York. And I just moved to DC about 5 weeks ago. But I remember, I was introduced to this work with police, 2 days before I graduated from seminary last June. And, it was right after I had just finished my intensive in seminary. And a buddy of mine in New York sent me this video. He knew I was moving to Asheville, and it was the chief of police, in Asheville, talking about the police reform efforts down there. And he said, if you're a member of the community and you want to be part of the police reform efforts, here's my email address. You can email me directly. And so the next morning, because in seminary, they just tell us when opportunities come, you just say yes. And so I was like, oh, this seems like one of those opportunities. Let me just say yes. And so I reached out to him and, I shared why I wanted to be part of this work and, talked about my credentials and what I could bring to the work and that I was feeling a call to the work. And based on my notes, they got back to me. They said they wanted to talk to me when I moved to Asheville. We had a sit down and the chief of police asked me a couple of things. He said, can you or how can you help me deepen the level of compassion among young officers and bring that into the police department? Another ask was, can you create conversations where the officers and the community can develop a new relationship together? And essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that helps humanize each other. And so I came back and I kept thinking about this idea of like a compassion boot camp, a compassionate masculinity lab, and a compassionate bridge building studio. From the compassion boot camp perspective, how do we receive and how do we just viscerally experience compassion? And then start to see the different ways that compassion exists in the world. Then the second, the compassionate masculinity lab, was based on this idea that since, especially in these hyper-masculine cultures, to show emotion, to be compassionate would be a sign of weakness, which would be a detriment to the work. So let's actually go into what are the messages that we have from this place of masculinity that tell us that compassion is weak, and how, if we can reframe our relationship to masculinity, then we can start to change the ways we associate with what compassion is. And so it was, being able to create those paradigm shifts for people. And then, bringing members of the community and officers into separate experiences around compassion, and then have them come in to meet with each other from this place of compassion. So I'm looking at you from a more compassionate lens, to be curious about who you are and your journey as opposed to just what I see on the surface. And from those places, can we hold this from a place of love? Can we hold, because implicit in compassion is love, right? So how can I hold this from this place of, in a sense, love for this fellow human being that takes us into a deeper connection around our humanity? That work then led to this consortium, this coalition that we formed nationally to create a compassion-centered systems change model for police departments across the country. And it's not just based on training, but it's like, how do we inject compassion into these departments, and into leadership, into the system, into the ways that they are thinking about officers, developing officers, and having the experience that officers experience in the cultures that exist, and how do we start to tap into creating culture transformation within these departments, that start to break down some of the walls and barriers and the us and them between, that often exists between the community and police departments.
Well, I love that so much of the work sounds like it is meeting both the individual officers at the personal level, making them do the work on compassion there, but then also on a systems-wide change. You're doing it at the micro and the macro levels. And what a you're like meeting the moment at the perfect time in our cultural conversation around reforming police, defunding the police, abolishing the police. We're just after the Derek Chauvin verdict.
Mm-hmm.
We are in different investigations now in different police departments across the nation. It's like you're meeting the moment at the exact right time with this project.
And now that the DOJ is also starting to look at some of these cases from a federal level.
Wow.
And the work is also taking me into federal agencies as well. And so, I think that's part of why I've been called to DC, to be able to look at this on a national level in the federal government and then ultimately bring this work onto a global stage.
I get chills thinking about the potential ripple effect of going into such big systems and creating change. What would you say to the people out there that, I mean, there's a lot of disagreement about how we approach this police reform or what we do with police and the challenges that are in policing. What would you say to the people that say that we've tried reforming and reforming doesn't work? We've tried trainings and it doesn't work. We have to abolish the system. What would you say as somebody that is actively participating in the reform process to that?
The team that I'm on, and so we have masculinity experts on the team. We have compassion experts, cultural transformation experts, members of the FBI, members of the military, all coming together and saying, how do we do this? The one thing that we challenge each other on is to check our biases. Are we in favor of the community or the police, or are we able to come from this place of neutrality that, we can bring that compassion to officers and community members? Because if we're swayed in one direction or the other, you're going to be able to feel that energy, right? And so how do we keep grounding ourselves from this place of compassion for all parties involved? So that's the first thing. The second is we're taking an inside-out approach where we realize that policing itself needs healing. Officers are part of this system. They need healing. The culture needs healing. And we're doing it from an inside-out approach in response to the context that everything is happening. And so I think that as we're doing this, and what I've found is, as the former head of personal transformation and well-being at Eileen Fisher, the whole premise was, if we want our employees to perform better, we have to help them become their best selves. Within that is the personal transformation and growth work. Within that is the healing work. Within that is the discomfort. And then within that is, by understanding who you are at your essence and at your core, you can make different decisions that are not biased, that are not coming from this place of wounded judgment or hatred. And what happens when more and more people in a department are coming from that place? And then you can then bring in accountability in a new way. And now with so many departments feeling like they have such negative community sentiment against them, that the compassion for them is even, if we want to create these changes, the need for compassion towards officers is even greater, than demonizing and making wrong and making bad. So I think that's implicit in when we talk about, coming from a place of compassion. How are we not making someone wrong? And often when we're coming from our own wounding, it can be very easy to come in from a place of judgment and say, you are wrong and I am right. And if we can let go of our need to be right and to really come from this place of how can we see things as they are? And I'm not saying, I am also saying this also needs to hold the place of accountability. We have to talk about, yes, there's injustice that's happening. There are so many deaths that are happening and the racial injustice that's happening, when all of that is in play as we're thinking about this. But to be able to then go to these officers and bring that in after we've talked about how do you even just come from a place of self-compassion? Because I believe that compassion for others can only start when we have compassion for ourselves. And when hypermasculinity can't feel, we can't be in community, we can't collaborate, we can't do X, Y, and Z, then we are constricted and restricted in the ways that we can actually be compassionate for others, to feel something for others, to even have that different level of consciousness. So I think from that place, if we're coming from this place of consciousness, compassion, and deeper connection, we're not just addressing racial injustice and the violence that's happening and the deaths that we're seeing in the media and the deaths that are happening. We're also addressing the suicides, the mental health issues, the addiction issues that are happening among police. And I think if we can do this work with police, law enforcement, and military, then we start to create a pathway to say, how do we bring this into other organizational systems and other community systems and reach more and more men?
I feel a lot of alignment with how you're sharing this, because it's sort of how I try to really focus in on holding my conversations around masculinity. It's very easy, especially currently in our current conversation, to shame men and to call men out and to point out the bad actors. And I think there is importance to the accountability piece. Don't get me wrong. I think it really is. But it's important to me within my conversations to embed enough psychological safety that we actually can talk about the challenges and have compassion and have places where we can see each other, because that's where change is possible. It's not from the place of being at opposite sides of the arena on a stare down with our guns up, ready to shoot at each other. That's where we're at as a culture. We're not getting there. And I think something that you're talking about that is so important is that it's the reform, the kind of reform that you're talking about is actually healing on an individual level, on a systemic level, on a cultural level. There's healing that's a part of it. And that to me feels radically different than anything I've heard in terms of the approach to police reform that has been in the past. It feels very different than just a training or gun safety or what's allowed in terms of chokeholds or aggression or deadly force. It feels different because it's actually about healing.
Yeah, I think it's about healing and transformation. Yeah. You know, and it's, I mean, in reality, healing and transformation coming from the feminine. So really bringing that, you know, when I was in a conversation with the chief of police at a department, and I'm like, yeah, you know, we're going to talk about, you know, helping to bring your officers into an integration of the healthy masculine and feminine. And when he didn't flinch and just said, tell me more, how does that happen? I knew there was something here that I think we're at a different point in time. We're at a point in time where we know the old ways aren't going to get us where we need to go. We also know that there's a different level of awareness, a different level of pain that we're experiencing, and the systems are crumbling before our eyes on multiple levels. And so that's, I think, when we talk about, you know, an emphasis on the feminine, it's how do we heal and how do we find a new way from that place and from that place of a different type of consciousness.
Yeah. If I give myself permission to actually play with having compassion for police officers in this case, or police systems that have their flaws and are in many ways not working, it makes me go back to my time as a social worker working for Child Protective Services. I was working with detectives in the family and family crimes units all the time. And even as a social worker investigating abuse and neglect with children, not only was compassion maybe considered weak within those systems as a man showing compassion in those, in some ways, because of what a police officer or a social worker, in my case, are witnessing and observing and the passive trauma they're taking on every single day, compassion does start to feel like a weakness, or it feels like harmful because you're over connected to somebody. I can see now on this side of my social work career that that's just an immature version of compassion. It's not really actually compassion. It was enmeshment or codependency or something along those lines of things. But we don't teach police officers, social workers, we don't teach how to be in healthy compassion that still has boundaries, that still can hold people and systems accountable. But we miss out on really teaching people what healthy compassion is in their ways of interacting with people. And even in a social work profession, which you would assume most social workers are pretty compassionate people, in some ways I saw so many of my coworkers and colleagues numbing to their compassion because it felt so painful to be sitting there against that trauma all the time. And so I imagine that's what police officers are. Part of what they're navigating all the time is taking on that passive level of trauma that without any skills for how to deal with it or navigate it, or even given permission to work through it, really.
Yeah, I think as we talk about compassion, we have to think about it holistically. You know, it's not just a concept, right? It's not just a thing we do. It's not a thing we do when I often find a lot of us intellectualize compassion, or we idealize compassion when it's convenient, right? I often ask, when I do bridge building conversations, I ask the question, how do you hold your greatest adversary with unconditional love and compassion? And then how do you hold yourself from a place of unconditional love and compassion? I think our capacity for compassion happens when we're able to really experience self-compassion.
Yeah.
When we've done the inner healing work on ourselves, that gives us more of an ability to then be compassionate for others and to hold it without getting exhausted by it. But I think there's also, what are the self-care practices that happen in tandem with this, so we are able to not hold on to the micro traumas of sorts, or the things that are just like piling on us. How are we doing this self-care over time so we're able to let go? I think that's an act of self-care and self-compassion. So that checking in with ourselves, really tapping into what's happening in our bodies, where are we at, what's coming through, and how are we able to let go, and how are we able to do the self-care, I think are all fundamental components of this. So we don't get paralyzed by our own level of being out there in the world.
Yeah, I think it's super important, that self-compassion piece, and is where it starts. And yet I even struggle with that at times. As a gay boy that grew up in this world, feeling like I failed as a man, internalizing a lot of shame, like self-compassion can be one of the most challenging things for me to not even apply, but even have awareness that I'm not being compassionate with myself at times.
So I think what you're saying, it's, sometimes I hear people say, I've done the work, right? You never are done with the work. The work never ends. It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
Right. And the more you do the work, the more you uncover, and the more you delve deeper, but then also the more you come into more of who you are each and every day you do it.
Yeah, and the more you evolve developmentally. There are so many places. I was having a previous conversation with a guest where we were talking about like adult development and how few people really move beyond sort of the self-authoring, the me kind of focus, and actually into perspective taking of others, and sort of stepping into that more authentic place where we get to be our unique, authentic expression in every moment, rather than in just little sections of our lives that we've created one little safe place where we can be that, but that we get to reclaim who it is, all of who it is we came into this world as, before we learn to sort of section parts of ourselves off.
That's why I think, as part of masculinity work or as part of men's work. When I first started in seminary, I would get visions and shamanic journey I would go on. But a lot of this is about the inner child work and how to bring us, how to take, and I don't even want to say like the psychological inner child work. I'm saying taking us back to childlike wonder and curiosity.
Yeah.
And this notion of creativity and play embedded in this work, as opposed to the hardcore, let's get your emotions out of you. It's like, how can creativity and play be a modality that allows us to come into a different type of truth, and that we can operate from this place of awe and curiosity and playfulness as we're doing this and with each other.
Yeah, it's the return to innocence. I always talk about that in my coaching work, that it's about, so much of the work I do with clients isn't about teaching them a new skill. It's about unlearning some of their socialized behaviors so that they can return to innocence, so that they can come into who they were when they came into this world, that child that knew how to play as they were learning, that knew that experimentation and not getting it right the first time wasn't a big deal, that just kind of was in the moment and responding to life and being present.
Yeah, that letting go of perfectionism. You said it, you alluded to it earlier, the stakes being high, where we have this perception that there's no room for failure and everything. We are striving to be in this place of perfection. If we can let go of that, and Eileen would say it on Fisher, perfect enough, to get us out of analysis paralysis or performance anxiety of trying to perform at this level of perfection. And so I think there's also just a lot of like, if we're able to just let go and move into this place of calm with the what is, I think that becomes very powerful for us, and it becomes a place of grounding.
That's so true. I'm really curious because it's a place that you and I connect on a deep level, as being two members of the queer community, two gay men that are actively working in men's spaces that are not just queer male spaces, that are also heteronormative spaces, that are hyper-masculine spaces. What's it like being a queer person doing this work?
In some ways, I sit there just scratching my head like, wow, this is what I do. And then part of it is like, yeah, this is what I do. It's like it's kind of a both and for me. I came out when I was 15, started a gay and lesbian youth group for the city of Dayton, Ohio when I was 16, which still exists today. Because I was sneaking into gay bars when I was 16 and thought we need a better way to connect. Back when we actually went to bars. And we didn't have other things to connect with others. And, so that's like, 30 something years old, that organization. And, like you said, I mean, the way I look, I have a more hyper masculine look. And so I'm able to get into a lot of spaces that maybe other men aren't, or other gay men wouldn't go. And, but because I have a highly evolved feminine energy that I've worked on for many years, I'm able to bring in a different perspective in a lot of the men's spaces that I'm in. And I think when I moved out of the fear, because I'll say, when I went to work for Eileen Fisher, part of the reason I went to work for Eileen Fisher is that so I'd never have to work with men again. And then leaving Eileen Fisher going, oh, I'm supposed to be part of this or help build a global men's movement of compassionate healing, and this compassionate masculinity idea, which all kind of transpired over 5 years. Then I was like, oh, then there's something here that I need to explore. And this is way beyond my pay grade. This is a spiritual journey of spiritual journeys. And so I went to seminary to get the spiritual grounding I needed. So now at this point, it all just feels very natural. And, when I'm sitting in conversations with Marines, former Marines, FBI agents, cops, NSA, DOJ, DEA, like whatever that is, I'm in these communities, I'm in these conversations with these folks, and they're listening to me talk about how do we open up our compassionate hearts. All of those other fears that I might have had earlier on in my life, they don't exist. It's just like we are connecting human to human about something very human. And I'm seeing them in their humanness and they're respecting in my humanness. And the labels and the identities no longer become as much of an issue. We're able to just see each other from this place of truth. And the thing that we are all yearning for, which is some sort of connection, yet because of our conditioning and our upbringing, many of us are just have lost that sense of how we actually connect in healthy ways. And so being able to model and showcase, here's a way for us to move forward in the ways that we connect with ourselves and the ways we connect with each other in healthier ways that are going to be more meaningful and fulfill us and enrich us, as opposed to keeping us separate and keeping us in this myth of the Lone Ranger that many of us think we have to do and shoulder everything on our own. Where our systems tell us this, our conditioning tells us this, our peers tell us this, our media does. And we can lift out of that and say, there's another way that we can connect that's going to touch our hearts and our minds. I think that's, yeah.
So what would you say are some of the early steps that you know of to healing those ways of connecting? It really feels true to me that we have in ourselves, like with our own relationship to ourselves, but our relationships to others as men, there are some damaged ways in which we connect.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't learned ways of healthy connection. So what would be some of the ways that you would sort of recommend that men can start that journey of healing the ways they connect to themselves and to others?
I think one thing that comes to mind immediately is go into environments or situations that are uncomfortable. Be surrounded by others who aren't like you, and be curious. I'm not going to give a prescribed set of behavior changes that I would say people need to do, because I think enough people are telling men how to be. So it's really more of a suggestion of get curious, go into different environments without the need to control the situations, and allow yourself to feel into what it means to be in a place that's uncertain or there's a not knowing. Walk into some of your edges of what you know is safe and what is known to you, and walk into the unknown. Surround yourself in community with people that are really going to see you and are going to value you no matter what. And they're going to value and see you even when you are operating outside of your shoulds of how you think you should be, and that they still accept you and love you. So I think community is key. I think being curious is key. Trying things that are different is key. And taking the time to kind of reflect and process what you're experiencing. What's showing up for you? What feelings are coming up for you? So I think those are some of the initial steps, as opposed to going, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Cause I think when anyone gives me a set of things I have to do, that feel out of my comfort zone, then I'm just going to not do them. And I feel like there's a lot of, the masculine way of approaching this is telling others what to do.
Mm-hmm.
The feminine way of doing this is creating an invitation and an offer.
Yeah.
And saying, I think this might be something that could help you, and it's going to help you come into your best self, as opposed to you're going to become this person that does this, and so I think so much of it comes down to also how we're extending the invitation as opposed to how we're creating demands that people need to change, because implicit in that is that something is broken and needs to be fixed.
That feels so true to me. It feels like if we were to prescribe what men need to do, the steps that they need to do, it does feel like the old way. It does feel like the old masculine style, which is to fix something that's broken. And every time that I have met a coach, met a spiritual person, met a therapist that says that they have the prescription for how to get to this, that say, here are the 3 easy steps to get here, I'm always like, no, I don't. It doesn't land with me. And those kind of systems, at least for someone like me who integrated a lot of shame growing up, they're so easy to trigger the shame element because those 3 easy steps don't get me there. And then now it's another personal failure on my side of things because I tried the thing that they said to do and I didn't get to where I want to be or where I said I was going to go. And so it feels so right to invite men into the development process, into their feelings, into their experiences, into being in community, into the not knowing. You were saying the not knowing piece. It's amazing how hard that is for most of us, that so much of our value and our okayness is in the knowing, and how difficult it is to be in spaces where we don't know and to remain curious.
You know, when I worked at Allen Fisher, we had an Akashic Records reader available to all employees.
I don't think many of the listeners that are listening to this podcast are going to know what that is. Yeah, so tell us what that is.
I was about to define it because I whenever I mention it now, I'm like, do you know what that is? So an Akashic reader, basically, each of us has a soul DNA record, which is our Akashic record. And an Akashic reader will really kind of, the way I interpret it is really channel the spiritual guides and teachers to give you a sense of how you're in alignment or out of alignment with your soul DNA record or your soul contract that you came into this lifetime with and that has carried with you from lifetime to lifetime. So we had one of those at my work. I just remember I would see her on a quarterly basis. And I remember, one session she said, so Sean, it's great that you have a vision and a plan. Now I want you to walk out of your masculine and into your feminine and walk from this place of curiosity and wonderment and let go of the need to control the outcome. And that's what I'm living now. That's what I'm living in DC. That's what I'm living, for definitely the last year or 2 years of my life since seminary. It's in seminary and since seminary. And, something in that letting go, there's something in that walking from this place of awe, wonderment, and curiosity that I think goes back to what you were saying, that childlike innocence. It allows us to kind of reconnect with what's true for us and what's our truth. And I really think that the work we're talking about, whenever I talk about the masculine, it's never about demonizing the masculine, because I often see, some folks in this space, we talk about the feminine and then we go to the feminine, but we forget to come back over to the masculine. And so we're losing sight that it's not about the feminine or the masculine. It's the integration of our energies in a balanced way to take us into the truth of our deeper humanity and really who we are and who we're meant to be in this world. But it's often constricted by being in one side or another, or moving, but not really coming into this place of this integration and balance, which is where we come into our true embodiment, where we come into our true sense of self and create a different energetic resonance in the world.
I'm so glad you shared that story. There's actually such an important gift for me personally in what you were sharing, because it was in that Akashic reading that you got that was about going into something with curiosity without trying to control the outcome. I've been playing with this pattern inside myself around how I relate to my work, to my business, to what I'm building. Mm-hmm. And I've recognized this pattern of sort of anxiously relating to it, being out ahead of it and trying to control the outcome. And so what you were just saying clicked in for me that so much of the anxious relating to it is because I'm trying to control the outcome and trying to force reality into something rather than staying open and curious within it. And I know that so much of the most amazing things that have come in my life have been because of open curiosity and saying yes to things. They haven't been in sort of muscling something through. And yet, as a man, I sometimes judge myself for not having a clear vision and a clear way to get there and making it happen, sort of like our cultural story of picking yourself up your bootstraps and making it happening and working really hard. I sometimes judge myself or shame myself for not doing it in that way. And yet, all the evidence of my life says where the magic is when I'm open and curious. Mm-hmm. And so there's a gift in there for me to hear you reflect that back, that if I notice the anxiety or the anxious relating to the work, it's because I'm trying to control the outcome and not staying open and curious to where it wants to go, where it can go, what's possible in the limitlessness of it all.
You know, it's interesting as you're saying that, because I think about my Asheville adventure. And had I controlled the outcome, that I would still be in Asheville, trying to create a retreat center. Right? And because that was my intention. That's why I went to Asheville. I was going to build this retreat center in Asheville, and that's not where I was supposed to go. And so when I allowed myself to be in that openness and curiosity, you know, with the Asheville Police Department, and now I don't think we would have what we're co-creating of this national model for compassion and policing had I been trying to control the outcome. And so there's something in that surrender that I think is so important, and to get comfortable with that not knowing, and to understand the fear that's coming up when we feel the need to control, and to start to say we have a choice between fear and love. And so a love-based perspective, a compassion-based perspective is going to open up things in a very different way than if we stay constricted in needing to control things because we're afraid of not being in control, in the ways that limits us and the possibility that we can create for ourselves and in the world.
Super powerful. Blown away. Thank you for bringing this bit towards the end of this conversation, because it's a gift to me, and I have a sense that this will be a gift to other men as well, or other people that are listening to this podcast. So you're not only just doing work with police reform, you're also doing other work, other men's work. You want to share anything about that?
You know, I want to just chime in on you know, just to close out this part of the conversation we just had, which is I now operate from the place of I have a North Star, and then I follow the spiritual breadcrumbs to see how that's going to manifest. So the North Star is, how do we create systemic change and global systems change around systems that are crumbling all around us and being dismantled? And in moving into the what's next, what needs to come through, to really support the evolution of our species and our planet. And so in my mind, it's all sort of, you know, I see how we hold space for this type of transformation is one piece. How we build bridges in a new way from deeper consciousness is another. How we do the work, bring in and introduce the work of men so that we can start to create space in power dynamics so that the voices of women and the voices of the feminine and those who don't identify as either, male or female, can be elevated so that we can start to innovate differently. And how do we start to think about the ways we lead from a more collaborative and moving from a control-based fear model to a compassion-based empowerment model? And then how can we come together and innovate around the new systems that want to come through, that are only going to come through when we tap into, you know, have spaces that allow us to tap into our deep intuitive knowing and have that deeper consciousness and collective wisdom shape what wants to come into the world. So that's how I see all this work, and the men's work is one element that, as women have been doing their work for so long, for men to catch up so that men, women, and those who are non-binary and trans can come into new spaces to be able to innovate. And while it's critical that men of color have their own spaces, there's also the opening when they're ready, that the men's spaces are truly integrated and truly inclusive for white straight men, queer men, men of color, black men, those who don't identify on the gender continuum, so that we are able to start having a much more inclusive conversation that then says, when we come together across gender from this place of inclusive men and women and those who don't identify, then we can then start to move into these spaces of true innovation and take the best of the thinking, the best of those energies, and start to innovate to societal challenges that the answers are becoming fewer and fewer and are not going to be created based on building upon what we already have in existence, but coming up with radically new ways of how do we operate as a society.
Okay, the minister's taking us to church over here. Go ahead and preach on it. I'm resonating with so much of what you just said.
That's just the vision, man.
It's a beautiful vision, and so much of it, I think you and I have different, maybe how would I say this, focal points, or, I mean, we're individual beings who are, what wants to come into this world comes through us in different ways, and yet we're so aligned in a value system sort of way, and in a North Star kind of way, about recognizing that women have been doing this work for a long time, and that we're the ones behind, and we're the ones that are in the footsteps of it. That we can learn so much from women and from people who have been doing this. Queer people have been doing this work for a long time too, the gender studies piece of things. And so there's so much that can be learned when we elevate voices that haven't been elevated before, when we allow that to help us innovate. It's why I have so many queer men on this podcast, is because if we're going to talk about masculinity, let's talk to the people that haven't had a voice yet in this conversation.
Right.
So thank you for sort of continuing to show what your North Star is, but it helps me feel seen in that. It helps me feel seen in the ways that we're viewing this similarly. And I think many of the people that are listening to this podcast would agree with that too, because we attract the people that start to see things in a similar way, and we're gathering momentum and community around this sort of shared North Star that has different ways in which it manifests, but that there's a similar guiding sort of principle of where we're headed.
Well, I think what's important is, as we do men's work, we do masculinity's work, they're always asking the question, in service of what? You know, as you were saying earlier, there's also a lot of the self-development, personal development movement can be very narcissistic.
Totally.
Right? And so it's about, how am I becoming my best self, but forgets about, because it's in service of something bigger.
Right.
And how am I realizing my gifts to contribute into the world, for what the world needs?
Yeah.
You know, and
what the world needs, not for what I need.
Right, exactly.
Because that is so true, that it is about often creating personal freedom for somebody, but that disregards impact on others, the world, the harm that's already been done that needs repair and healing. It doesn't fully encapsulate it most of the time in self-help. I totally see that as true.
Yeah.
Well, you have given us so much powerful information to digest and so much powerful wisdom. I'm wondering if we can sort of land this conversation in one little sort of nugget. If there was one piece of advice or an offering you would like to leave men with who are listening to this podcast, or leave anybody with, what would that be?
I think it always comes down to letting go. You know, I think it's just, as simple as that might sound, it's how do we let go of conditioning? How do we let go of our shoulds? How do we let go of our expectations of self? And how do we let go of our expectations of others? And how do we let go so we can actually be in a place of the not knowing, so we're able to then just be? And how do we move from the doing to the being so we can really get to our essence?
Amen. So if people wanted to find out more about you, the work you're doing, the police reform work, other men's work that you're doing, how might they find you out there in the world?
I think the best way is to go to my website, which is symphonia.institute.com. And symphonia is a Greek word for compassion. So we also have a Symphonia Men's Studio, so compassionate men's studio, essentially. And so much of what I'm talking about, what I've been talking about is all on the website. And the police work is launching in a more formalized way shortly, so there'll be more information on that. But it really is a coalition and a collective as opposed to just mine. So that is coming, and would love to have other men who are involved in leading men's work come into the community of the studio, because I believe the studio can be a repository for what is the next frontier of men's work from a variety and diverse communities of men, those who are male-bodied and those who don't identify as men but have a voice for and perspective on the ways that men can elevate and evolve.
I'm definitely coming to that.
Awesome.
So appreciate that. Well, I'll make sure that everything is in the show notes so that people can easily find how to get in contact with you. And for those people, those men who are interested in doing men's work and who are doing men's work, how they can find you so that we can all participate in this conversation together. I really like that sort of safe container idea that you're holding for lots of different voices to talk about the next frontier of men's work. I think that is an important aspect that isn't being quite addressed right now in men's work. So thank you for offering that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sean. This has been such a delight of a conversation. I knew we would obviously have a delightful conversation based on our friendship and what we've talked about so far, but this has been above my expectations. So thank you so much for joining me and for offering your wisdom to the New Masculine.
Oh, thanks for having me and hosting me and being with me in the conversation. It's been awesome.
Yeah, of course. If people want to connect with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Travers03, or you can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. If you're interested in supporting the mission of the New Masculine, you can also become a contributor through my Patreon page. That is patreon.com/thenewmasculine, patreon.com/thenewmasculine to become a contributor and to support me as I continue developing the mission of the New Masculine. Thanks again, Sean, for joining me, and until our next episode, thanks everyone.